Welcome to Pod Save America. I'm Jon Favreau.
I'm Jon Lovett.
I'm Tommy Vietor.
All right, let's get to the news. So the bar for what counts as a bombshell story has been raised pretty high here in the Trump era, but the New York Times certainly cleared it with their piece on Friday. Quote, American intelligence officials have concluded that a Russian military intelligence unit secretly offered bounties to Taliban-linked militants for killing coalition forces in Afghanistan. And here's what's even more stunning. The Times reports that this information made its way, quote, to the highest levels of the White House, was included in the president's daily brief, and was the subject of a National Security Council meeting in late March. It is now late June, and the Trump administration has done absolutely nothing to respond to intelligence that Russia paid militants to kill American troops, which, according to another report last night from the Washington Post, they succeeded in doing. Here's what Joe Biden had to say shortly after the news broke.
Not only has he failed to sanction or impose any kind of consequences on Russia for this egregious violation of international law, Donald Trump has continued his embarrassing campaign of deference and debasing himself before Vladimir Putin. He has this information, according to the Times, and yet he offered to host Putin in the United States and sought to invite Russia to rejoin the G7. His entire presidency has been a gift to Putin. But this is beyond the pale. It's a betrayal of the most sacred duty we bear as a nation, to protect and equip our troops when we send them into harm's way.
Tommy, Trump says he was never told, never briefed. The White House said he wasn't briefed. But they also haven't really challenged the central reporting about the existence of the intelligence report, or the fact that there was an NSC meeting, or the fact that the administration hasn't responded yet. I guess Kayleigh McEnany just now was given a press briefing where she said there wasn't consensus in the intelligence community about the report. Do you think it's believable that Trump wasn't briefed? And I guess beyond that, what's your general reaction to this whole story?
I don't think it's believable. I mean, look, I assume they're lying with most things, but this in particular. I mean, Russia deciding to put bounties on the heads of U.S. and British service members is a very big deal. It's something that would require a policy decision and that you would need to brief to the President of the United States. When I initially read the reports in that denial, I did wonder about the intelligence itself and wondered maybe if it wasn't all that strong. But there have been these subsequent press reports that say the basis for this intel was Navy SEALs found $500,000 in U.S. cash in a Taliban stronghold, which is very unusual. And then they were interrogating captured Taliban members, and they heard about the bounties that way. The Times also reported that the CIA later confirmed what the military had learned and that the U.S. had briefed the U.K. on these findings. So those are all indications that we believe this to be true, or we believe it to be credible enough to share with allies. And so I guess there's a chance that Trump wasn't briefed on the information because he just literally doesn't do his job, right? I mean, John Bolton in his book says Trump gets the PDB once, maybe twice a week. He doesn't read any intelligence reports. He doesn't try to learn about policy. So maybe their argument is like, hey, we would have briefed him if we had time, but he was too busy watching Fox and Friends. But I just think that the other option maybe is they're so conditioned to hearing Trump get mad when he hears something negative about Russia. He has this weird affinity for Putin. He consistently takes Putin's word over his own government, so maybe they don't broach the subject anymore around him. But look, I think we should just default assume that they are lying about this like many other things.
So we learned that the Trump administration has known about this since March. It's now July. They haven't done a thing about it. What are your thoughts on the fact that they just haven't reacted in any way to this?
I don't know. It is baffling. I mean, options include incompetence, the fact that he doesn't want to hear anything negative about Russia ever. I don't know. I mean, it's really hard to speculate on why it is they are so bad at the job, but there are a host of reasons one could consider.
Lovett, what was your reaction to the story?
It was very bad. It's a very bad story. I was struck by, so first of all, it's remarkable how much of our politics rotates around what this means for Trump, even in the immediate follow-on to a story this damning, not just about Trump, but about what Russia is doing to attack the United States, attack U.S. interests, whether it's interference in our election or trying to have Americans killed abroad. And immediately Trump's response is, I didn't know anything about this. As if that's the most important question. We don't know what the truth is. We'll never get a true answer from the White House about it. Was it something in his daily brief that he didn't read or didn't pay attention to? Was it something that they are conditioned by Trump's abuse of office to not bring to him? It doesn't really matter. What we learned from the Bolton book, what we learned from the reporting around Ukraine, what we just learned in reporting around what about Trump said about the Uyghurs in China. Trump views everything through the lens of what it means for his personal relationships, his past, present, and future financial interests. Biden's response is all about, Trump being in the pocket of Putin, and I understand that, I get that. But we are constantly confronted by a president who, across a variety of fronts, doesn't care about America's interests, doesn't care if we live or die, whether it's around the coronavirus or American service members in Afghanistan, because it's 100% through the lens of what it means for him, his ego, what he said in the past, what he's trying to do around the G7 or what have you, and it's just yet another sort of damning example of that.
It does seem like this is one that a number of Republicans in Congress have also sort of demanded more information, including Trump supporting conservatives like Liz Cheney, Dan Crenshaw, Lindsey Graham. I see that the White House is giving a briefing today about this only to Republicans.
Yeah, only to Republicans. Way to build confidence in your response.
Yeah, it does. I do think it's, I think I saw Pelosi on the Sunday shows talking about, as I always say, all roads lead to Putin. But, there is the Putin angle to this. There was also the angle that just can you imagine being American service members and learning that there was possibly a bounty put on your head by Russia and your commander in chief knew about it or his administration knew about it and did nothing about it?
Yeah, look, I think that's why you see even people like Dan Crenshaw, who is as big a Trump fan as there comes, tweeting that we need to get to the bottom of this. I think this is not going to go over well in the U.S. military or among veterans. It is really pretty staggering to just sit on this information for at least 3 months. There are some reports that they heard about this intelligence back in January. What the hell was done to protect U.S. service members from these attacks? We literally, this is your job as commander in chief. This is one of the most important things you do.
It's such an overdetermined sort of Trump scandal, right? It would be enough if he was sycophantic towards Russia in a way we can't fully explain based on the information that we have. It would be enough if he was so grossly incompetent that he can't read or pay attention to the intelligence briefings he received. It would be enough if he had this deference towards dictatorial regimes and autocrats around the world. All of those individually would be a scandal of epic proportions for the American presidency, but he does them all at once, and it makes it really hard to mete out what the exact motivations are and what's going on inside the administrations, and especially because they're never going to tell us the truth about it.
Yeah, he's also we learned, Biden said this in his response, but since then he's talked to Putin and invited him to the G7, knowing this intelligence. At least the administration knew this intelligence. It is wild. But to your point, Lovett, the motivation almost doesn't even matter at this point. It is yet another example of the fact that Donald Trump, President of the United States, is just not cut out for the job, not doing the job, not, the world happens around him, crises happen around him, and he is just sort of not there, not doing anything about it. That is the results are the same, even though we can't always tell what the fucking motivation is with him.
Yeah.
It's bad. All right. So the president was not going to let this Russia story keep him from his true passion of tweeting the most awful shit possible all weekend. On Sunday, he shared a video with his 82 million followers that showed his supporters driving a golf cart in a Florida retirement community while chanting white power to a group of protesters. In a tweet, Trump thanked the supporters who he referred to as, quote, great people. 3 hours later, the tweet was deleted and the White House said that Trump didn't hear the phrase white power, even though it was repeated 3 times by 2 men in the first 12 seconds of the video. A few weeks ago, we talked about that NBC story about how the Trump campaign couldn't decide whether the president should embrace police reform and give a speech on race and unity, or whether he should double down on racist culture wars. Seems like he made a decision, huh, Tommy?
Yeah. Look, he is He is basically a rusty old Confederate monument just waiting to be torn down himself. I mean, I love the suggestion that a phrase uttered in the first 10 seconds of the video, just like he didn't hear it, but that like a bunch of like a half dozen old people on golf carts showed enormous enthusiasm for the Trump campaign. Like it's not funny because it's disgraceful that our president would tweet out white supremacist content repeatedly on top of all the other stuff he did this weekend. But like their lies are just so unbelievable at this point that I almost can't believe that 4 years into it, you still have the media sort of treating them as credulous and being like, well, the president says he didn't hear the obvious loud, white supremacist remark made right at the beginning of the video. It's ludicrous.
I also, Lovett, noticed on a couple people on Twitter being like, it's a diversion. He's trying to He's trying to distract us from the Russia story. And I'm like, here's the thing. First of all, it's not a diversion. It's morally repugnant racism. First of all. Second of all, if you want to talk about the politics of it, just from a pure political level, like, why is he distracting us to pay attention to something that is also not politically helpful for him?
Don't pay attention. Trump's launch of a nuclear missile into Western Europe is a distraction. I'm not interested in that at all.
It's so frustrating.
It is amazing. We're now 4 years into. It is now 4 years since Donald Trump became the Republican nominee, basically, and we're still playing this game with his sort of selective hearing. He says there's great people on both sides, but wasn't talking about them saying Jews will not replace us. Now he's tweeting this white power, but he deleted it 3 hours later after some criticism because apparently he didn't hear it. Of course, he's like this wink and a nod, the kind of not really plausible, but what they would consider plausible deniability on his ability to kind of send a message to the worst parts of his base, the white supremacist base, his either future political coalition or future audience at Trump News. Of the renamed OAN, whichever way it goes, he'll be fine. And it's a waste of time to debate what his intentions were. We know what his intentions were. They've been the same since he fantasized about bullets dipped in pig's blood as a candidate. We know what he's after here. It's not a secret.
It also seems like it is much more than that tweet and whether or not he fucking heard the video. I mean, middle of a pandemic, coronavirus cases surging, economy's in the shitter, police reform is sort of like paused in Congress and is probably dying in Congress. And on Friday, his executive order is directing the Justice Department to prioritize the prosecution of protesters who damage federal monuments. So Donald Trump's big move last week was protecting those Confederate statues. And he thinks this is a winning issue for him. He was also tweeting out FBI wanted posters of protesters who tried to take down those statues all weekend. What do you think about, he basically thinks this is a winning issue, but it's not, right? Like his culture war identity politics, at least for right now, are not working for him in his campaign. Why do you guys think that is?
I mean, I just think that, why do you think? I think people's views on race have changed, and they've changed dramatically. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement deserves a lot of credit for it. I mean, the recent New York Times poll, I believe, had 59% of voters who believe that George Floyd's murder was part of a broader pattern of excessive police violence towards African Americans. Black Lives Matter and the police have nearly identical, very favorable ratings. But Trump's handling of racial issues is disapproved by basically a 2-to-1 margin. So people are not stupid. They see that he is inciting racial violence. And it is not lost on them that rushing to put out an executive order about protecting statues is an absurd waste of time when you have coronavirus cases spiking and the economy in free fall. And so, I think people have just seen through this. Now, what's particularly worrisome to me is that a lot of these tweets seem to really be promoting like vigilantism. When you're tweeting out like most wanted posters, when you have people taking violent action at protests, like in New Mexico, there was one far right extremist who shot a protester, right? Like this is really bordering on incitement, if not already there. And it's really worrisome to me. But I do think like just politically, he is so far off of understanding where the country is right now that it is a very self-defeating strategy, if there is a strategy at all.
Yeah, it's he's shared. There's this strange phenomenon right now. There's people joke, "Oh, Twitter's not real life. Twitter's not real life." But because so much of real life has been turned off because of the pandemic, in many ways, like a lot is playing out on Twitter, and it becomes a place where people surface what they see, and it becomes a place where some of the worst behavior and worst conduct is shared, like a Victorian melodrama. There's like snidely whiplash piano music, and it's like, look at this woman throwing shit at an AMP because she didn't want to wear a mask. Like, look at this awful conduct that we saw. A lot of it an important symbol of people's selfishness, people's racism. Like that is a big part of this moment. Trump sees that, and as president, he sees a rising kind of multiracial coalition currently protesting, currently coming out in favor of more compassionate, more generous policies. And it's not just a danger to him, it's a danger to the operating principles of Republican politics. And he doesn't particularly know how to respond. But the one thing he knows is that what has worked for him in the past is find the sources of division, find the places where there's the most animus and anger and rage and grievance, and spin that up. Share the couple on their lawn pointing guns at protesters who are doing nothing more than passing by their house. Share a video claiming that there's nothing to the Black Lives Matter movement. Share an image of a bunch of old people bickering over him, about him, including two old people saying white power. Like stir the pot, turn up the heat, add fuel to this fire, and maybe, just maybe, there's a way he can win in that kind of divisive, toxic environment.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you look at that piece that Ested Herndon wrote in the New York Times with some of that polling that Tommy mentioned, if you're looking for like bad news in those polls, Ested mentions in the piece, 40% of white voters believe that discrimination against white people is almost as bad now as discrimination against Black people, right? But 40% of white voters is not enough to get you a majority, not nationally, not even in the battleground states anymore, where Trump has an electoral college advantage. And you do get the sense that sort of the country is passing him by on these issues, finally, even though in 2016, he just eked out that majority in the battleground states. But I think the protests and just the passage of time over the last several years have really shifted something. I mean, on the day that Trump shares that video, the Mississippi legislature voted to change its state flag, which still included the Confederate battle emblem. Mississippi, by a very large margin, in the states that, not a bunch of liberals down there in Mississippi in the legislature. And to me, that was just like having the president of the United States share that video on the same day that Mississippi does it is like, you know what? I don't know that he, like you said, Lovett, he thinks the world is sort of what's happening on Twitter and all the fights on Twitter and Fox and OAN. And that's really not an accurate reflection of the country anymore, or even a majority of voters in these states that he needs to win.
Yeah, I mean, 55% of Mississippians wanted to change the flag. The U.S. military was ready to tee up a conversation about getting rid of Confederate names on U.S. bases, and Trump's move was just to shut down that conversation. I do think it shows that he is completely out of step with the country, with institutions, with southern states, with everybody.
Yeah, I wonder too, like if we're sitting here on, Wednesday, November 4th, and Donald Trump was reelected, and we look at how he could have shifted it. It would have had to involve the total kind of, unleashing of a negative campaign about Joe Biden that was incredibly effective. But one of the things we've talked about before and seen in these polls is Donald Trump's shocking underperformance amongst the seniors that used to be the people that were going to have to get him elected. And I wonder if there's some thought here, if you call it a thought, that if there's any hope for him to win, it's getting those white seniors scared again, getting them aggrieved again, getting them angry again, getting them back. And
I think they're all more scared of dying,
Right.
That is exactly right. And if we wake up and that's the result, I think it will be less about the fact that he ran a white identity politics, racial grievance campaign, which, remember, in 2018, he did this with the caravan in the last couple months. Also didn't work for him because it turned off a bunch of suburban, moderate, independent voters, even though it might have juiced some of his margins in the red states. If he pulls it together, it will be because those seniors are somehow no longer afraid that he is sort of leaving them to fend for themselves in the middle of a pandemic, and that he has done something to not only fix the virus, but fix the economy. And then, the focus is taken off his response to this sort of racial reckoning right now, and it's back towards the economy. That's the hope. The hope is not sort of running the same play that he's been running for the last couple of years on race. I don't think that works for him anymore.
Yeah, and you look at, you look at this reckoning we're having around racial injustice and the way it's sort of reshaping the dynamics, even amongst white voters on some of these issues. You look at the coronavirus, how it has alienated him from his base. You look at the economic situation and the fact that it has totally obliterated his main argument for his reelection. And you start to see why he is reaching back to find arrows, and there's no arrows back there for him to grab.
Just playing the hits. So one story with enormous implications that broke late last week was when the Trump administration filed an 82-page brief that formally asked the Supreme Court to strike down the entire Affordable Care Act, a move that would cause 23 million Americans to lose their health coverage and eliminate protections for 130 million Americans who have pre-existing conditions. The Supreme Court will probably hear oral arguments in the case this fall, but will likely not decide the case until after the election. On Sunday, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar was asked by Jake Tapper what Trump's Obamacare replacement plan is, and he said they don't have the exact details yet. Joe Biden responded in a speech he delivered in Pennsylvania on Friday. Here is a clip.
Perhaps most cruelly of all, if Donald Trump has his way, those who have complications from COVID-19 could become the new pre-existing conditions. Some survivors will experience lasting health impacts like lung scarring and heart damage. And if Donald Trump prevails in court, insurers would be allowed once again to strip away coverage, jack up premiums, simply because of the battle they survived fighting coronavirus.
Tommy, I want to know which geniuses in the White House thought it was a good idea to take away healthcare protections from a third of the country in the middle of a pandemic just a couple of months before the election.
Yeah, it's maybe this is a fool's errand, but I do sometimes try to imagine the staff meetings where these things get decided and what the logic might be. And the only thing I could come up with is that we've known since day one that he had a long list of Obama era accomplishments, and that the Affordable Care Act was like the big boss at the end, right? It's like Mike Tyson at the end, and he just wants to get to the, he wants to win the game and just take down the ACA. But it is political insanity to do this in the midst of a pandemic. This must poll 80% disapproval. I can't even imagine how bad the polling would be on the question of should we rip away healthcare from 23 million Americans in the midst of a pandemic.
I mean, Lovett, it does seem like he gave some sort of indication of how unpopular this is when he tweeted in all caps that he will, quote, always protect people with pre-existing conditions. Always, 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 3 exclamation points.
Yeah, I mean, look, here we are. We are 10 years into the repeal effort. 10 years of this, right? It was,
that is wild. I thought you were exact. Yeah, it has been. It's almost 10 years.
10 years. 10 years. We've seen dozens of votes in the House, successful votes to repeal it when it was under Republican control. Obviously, it failed in the Senate once they actually had to do the political work of actually showing what that alternative could be. We are now years into this legal effort to undermine or undo Obamacare from states' attorneys general and from now the Trump administration. We are also years into the sabotage effort by the Trump administration and by Republican governors and legislatures in states that refused free money from the federal government to bring huge amounts of cash from the federal government into their states to provide health care through Medicaid. So we are now a decade into this effort, and Still to this day, there is no alternative. There is no explanation for what happens because there is none. It is a lie. If it is undone, that will be it. There is nothing to replace it. There's nothing for them to do. They have no plans. They have no ability to do that. So the only thing they're really going to do is lie about it because they've been lying about Obamacare for a decade, and a lie can make something unpopular for a while, but what it can't do is help you build the coalition you need to actually come up with an alternative. They don't have one, and so this will continue to be an albatross around their necks, and I don't know why they continue to do it, except to Tommy's point, it's something they said they would do, and again, to our earlier conversation, their base of older white voters have Medicare and don't view this as something that will hurt them.
Yeah. I mean, so Biden, let's talk about Biden for a second. He said in his speech that he's going to outline a new healthcare proposal in the next few weeks to guarantee that no one would have to spend more than 8.5% of their income on health insurance and that poor Americans would pay even less. He also reiterated his belief that a public option is more important than ever now that so many people are losing their private insurance. It does seem highly unlikely he'll just embrace Medicare for all because he campaigned against it throughout most of the primary. But Lovett, do you think the current political climate allows him to move closer? And how far should he go? Can he go?
I think so. The primary being fought on Medicare for all versus a public option and it becoming pretty acrimonious because that's politics and it's fine. But has, I think, made this debate a little bit confused to me because I do think there ought to be a pretty big coalition of Democrats coming out in favor to help the tens of millions of people who may lose insurance because their insurance is with their job and we're in the midst of an economic crisis, to allow those people into a public program. There seems to be a real moment where because of this economic crisis, we can debate the single payer versus a public option. We should have that debate, but right now is a real moment where you could move millions and millions of people permanently into a public system. And that does seem to be a place where there should be some alignment between the single payer crowd and the public option crowd. I don't know.
Tommy, what do you think?
I mean, look, I think it's a pretty compelling argument in the middle of a pandemic to say, hey, maybe it's a bad idea to have your healthcare coverage tied to your employment. I think that was a good argument before. It's a better argument now. But let's just say, okay, Biden does come out in favor of Medicare for all tomorrow. I think people just need to recognize that the challenge will then be convincing a bunch of Democrats in the Senate because he would have to make calls to people like Jeanne Shaheen, Doug Jones, Gary Peters, who are incumbents, as well as challengers like Mark Kelly and Cal Cunningham in North Carolina, who have, I think, come out for more moderate positions, more let's expand on the ACA, let's include a public option. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying you shouldn't try, but I think your question is sort of about that political dynamic and what is possible right now. And those would be the next steps that would have to come after Biden announcing his support for a bigger, more expansive plan.
Yeah, I think one of the consequences of the primary debate was that it was sort of reduced to public option versus Medicare for all, and all the different public option plans were treated the same when they were not. And Pete Buttigieg's public option plan was far more robust than Joe Biden's. And the plan that Kamala Harris and Beto O'Rourke embraced was even more robust than the Pete Buttigieg plan or the Joe Biden plan. And the question with the public option is, and sort of the hope of some of the more progressive proponents of a public option is, can a public option eventually crush the private insurance system on its own as more and more people join the public option because they think it's more efficient, that it's lower premiums, that it covers more people. And so eventually sort of the insurance companies just sort of go away and die out on their own. And there's sort of different levers to pull and different ways to make it a more palatable choice. And I do think as Biden and the Unity Task Force, which has a lot of Sanders people on it, is considering this, I think there is a lot of room for him to sort of lean towards some of the more robust public option plans that we saw in the primary, as opposed to sort of the one that he ran on. So
I also just, whether you're for single payer, if you are for Medicare for all, the more people we get into the public system, the easier that kind of transition will be in the long run. Yeah. And right now is, I think, a political moment where, to Tommy's point about how poorly undoing Obamacare right now must poll, making sure in this emergency that every single American has access to something like Medicare or Medicaid, I think is another issue where you will see incredibly broad popular support.
Quick notes about two other Crooked Pods. The final episode of Wind of Change is now available on all platforms, so check it out if you haven't already. And on Pod Save the People, DeRay and Sam have welcomed 2 new people to their team. Kaya Henderson and Diara Ballinger will be joining for the news each week. Kaya is the former chancellor of the DC Public Schools, and Diara is a State Department alum who was also Hillary Clinton's director of engagement. Very exciting additions. If you haven't already, go check out Pod Save the People.